Welcome to this special edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilot Podcast, episode 39. My name is John Potter. I'm the chair of the Pilot Assistance team at WestJet. I've been a pilot here for 18 years. I'm captain in Toronto. And Pilot Assistance team, we provide peer support for our colleagues for anything professional or personal going on in their lives. And I've been doing this work on Pilot Assistance team for, 10 years now. So today I've been joined by Doug McKibbon, a psychologist and workplace consultant and mental health professional. And really happy to have him here. And welcome, Doug. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, John. Thanks.
And could you just tell us a little bit about your background,
Sure.
Doug?
Ever since college or university, I've been involved in mental health in the workplace. Back in '86, started working with CN Rail and in their employee assistance program. And much of my career has been always involved in safety-sensitive occupations, often policies and practices and support for folks that have substance abuse issues. And so CN and then grad school, then went back to, started working with a lot of other oil and gas companies, Greyhound, bus lines, lawyers, physicians in providing that support for mental health and often with a target around substance abuse, just because of the complexity of it. I had a brief stint of teaching at the University of Lethbridge in the addictions counseling program, but I am a private sector guy.
Okay.
So I needed to get back out of the institution.
Gotcha.
And was able to get hired by Continental Airlines, and so moved from Lethbridge to Newark, New Jersey in 2001. And so trial by fire, new Canadian, post 9/11, working in the airline business. And so in their employee assistance program, which is in-house as opposed to an external agency. So I was there for 16 and a half years through the merger with United Airlines, worked generally out of Newark, with all of the departments of the airline, flight ops. So I spent a lot of time with flight ops to make sure that folks would be able to get their medical back. And so worked a lot with the FAA, with treatment centers, in working and understanding the medical is so critical on so many different levels. So worked there for 16 and a half years, was able to retire about 7 years ago from United and returned back to Alberta, where I'm registered as a psychologist, and picked up work here in working with the WestJet's program. Worked alongside with Dr. Brendan Adams, and now do a lot of work, some work as well with Trevor Gilmore in the East. And so a lot of work with transport and, my experience with the FAA and the U.S., and now my experience here with Canadian Airlines and transport, regularly do evaluations as well as the monitoring process. So that's my CV, if you will, around working a lot with aviation. I still think a lot in aviation terms. IROP, non-rev, what do we do here? What's this checklist? All those details.
And I think it's important that Doug and I have had a relationship for some time where on the Pilot Assistance team, if I have questions about how to proceed in certain ways, I have reached out to Doug in the past and gotten some feedback from him. So him and I have known each other for some time now, and really happy to have you on the podcast. So thanks for coming on again there, Doug.
Thanks.
It's been a difficult few months for our pilot group here, and this special series we're opening a conversation that honestly isn't an easy conversation to have, and I think I certainly haven't had very often or thought about very often. And it's a difficult one, so we wanted to put that out there at the beginning here and lead with that we will be talking about suicide today for anyone out there who may want to stop at this moment. Losing 2 pilots in the last few months has been very tragic and shocking to the pilot group. I know myself included, a lot of us struggling with that, to understand, to come to terms with it. And it's taking its toll on the group, I think. And so we've decided, as a group, what can we do? And we feel it's important to open up and have an honest conversation about suicide. As a collective group here, what I've come to learn is that we're certainly not immune to suicide as the general population. And in a lot of cases, we're actually more vulnerable. I found out that statistically, working age men 35 to 65 are the highest risk to die by suicide. And as a lot of us know, especially as our group grows older, that encompasses a fair chunk of our pilots. As difficult as this discussion may be, we feel it is service to those we've lost to only speak about suicide behind closed doors or not at all. In fact, what the experts encourage is to have conversations about suicide and just hopefully normalize it to some extent, that conversation, and destigmatize these things to the extent possibly where someone may be able to speak up who's struggling. Speaking openly about suicide also allows us to gain an understanding that allows us to build the protective factors and resilience within our pilot group. So we thank you for listening today. You know, Doug, this discussion today isn't intended to be an all-encompassing, comprehensive understanding, of suicide, but rather a conversation and a starting point for us to talk. So, I've been thinking a lot about these losses we've had in the last few months and trying to understand how someone can get to that place where they feel like they can't go on living. The more I've looked into it and come to an understanding is that there's some emotional pain, overwhelming really, involved in this loss, and not the hope is sort of gone of things to get better. Can you speak to this and how someone can get to this point?
It's really tough when people, when there is a suicide in our lives, and we sort of have lots of questions, and it really becomes kind of confounding. It's like, what went on? And we get really quite confused, and then because we can't really understand it. And it feels that we don't even have opportunity to ask questions. And so much of our work around, or much of the training and our prevention efforts is all about what are we doing as far as watching for risk factors and knowing where the struggles are and what do we do and how do we pay attention in ahead of time. And because sometimes it's about just checking in with somebody. Right? We have a lot of suicides in this country, about 4,500 a year. So this is not an uncommon, but it's too big. But at the same time, it's like, well, what can we do to prevent it, and what are the risk factors? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. It is the biggest leading factor for our young people, 15 to 29-year-olds. That's really concerning. And some areas of the country are really quite concerned about that because they have such a high rate of youth suicide, in addition to the older population, the 35 to 65.
Yeah,
the people around this table.
Yeah, and I mentioned men from 35 to 65, and there's another statistics that jump out at me was that women were 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. So it's not just one group really either. It's everyone, and so I hope we can just open up this conversation and someone who's struggling with that, do they have a mental illness? Is there depression involved? Is that something that is always there, or is it not necessarily?
Not always there.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of things that contribute, and part of it is there can be patterns, but it's not an absolute, if you're depressed, you must be suicidal. Not necessarily.
Okay.
There's a variety of factors. And, some of it has to do with, is there a mental health disorder? As in, is there a brain disorder that's going on within your mental health, whether it be about depression, which is not enough dopamine and a number of other biological factors, or you've got too much. There's way too much anxiety. And it can be things such as a medical issue as well. For example, if you're living with chronic pain, there's nothing that, where it's chronic. It never subsides. It's difficult. It ends. It's never ending. And where's the sense? And so there's a sense of we lose hope. And so it may be depression, but there may be a whole bunch of other things, such as that sense of hopelessness. Certainly a risk factor is if there's been a previous attempt or if there's been an instance of suicide in your family.
Yes.
Because then it becomes part of the storyline or the family line that says, oh, well, that's an option.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, when that is in the family, that's an issue. Often we think about, substance use and, oh, no, that has nothing to do with it. It actually does. Because substance use and the way that alcohol and or other substances affect the brain and affect the psychology of what's going on in your head and sort of the social interactions have a whole impact and create much higher risk when if there is substance misuse, abuse, heavy drinking, all of those factors are really, really important. So, substance use, certainly chronic issues like what's going on at home, if you've got a health concern, if you've just had a recent family member who's passed away, just the wear and tear of caring for our seniors or caring for a special needs child, all of those can wear heavy. And the way that I envision it, I invite you to put your hands together and start rubbing them. And if that's the case, you'll keep doing that for a while. And then if you keep doing it for long enough, eventually they will.
Yeah, your hands are going to
they'll get
raw.
warm, and then they'll not only get warm, they'll start to blister,
Yeah.
and then they'll start to bleed. But if you then stop, it's like, oh, this doesn't feel normal. And so there's a sense that the pain creates so much distress inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so by being able to sort of say, hey, what's going on? What are the factors here?
Yeah, that's a good point. The pain, there's certainly a pain, whatever is causing that pain, and that's probably a hard thing for someone to understand, to how to fix that. And that's what a point I can see that.
Right.
Something that, in the research that I've looked at and the training that I've had here now is there's some myths out there about suicide. And, one, talking about suicide will not cause suicide. There's some misconceptions, I think, that by speaking about suicide, it's going to give someone the idea that suicide is a good idea, and that's not the case.
Most people will have a consideration of suicide at some point in their life, or even imagine it,
Mm-hmm.
and then they will step back and go, no, I don't want to do that. I have some other things to go. So asking that question allows them to sort of disclose what's been going on in their head, and then you can work with it, because otherwise it becomes the committee that's in your head, and that sometimes is a dangerous place to be.
Okay. Another just sort of myth I thought I put out there, or speak about a little bit about, is asking someone about suicide, which would make them angry, and we don't want to make someone angry who's thinking about suicide. And again, what I see is from the experts not the case. It actually can lower someone's anxiety because someone's just open communication, and it lowers the risk of some impulsivity, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is a sense that, oh, well, that would be that might be what you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so by asking that, you can help clarify. I did that question just recently to a client who's like, no, oh goodness, how could you have even said that to me?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I needed to ask, because you were talking about, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so what does that mean? And so exploring it is reasonable, so that way you can know, are you providing the right help?
Yeah, and you're just sort of speaking about it there, and I'll bring it up now, is how to help someone if you do consider that they're maybe at risk of suicide, and directly asking someone, are you thinking about suicide, is always sort of the number one direct advice given by the organizations and experts of how to ask someone. It should be very direct. They say particularly with men, you shouldn't beat around the bush. It's a direct way, and this straightforward and direct questioning hopefully allows someone to just be able to maybe say yes.
And just saying yes doesn't mean that anyone's going to do that. It's like, yes, oh, I've thought about it. Oh, okay. What else are you going to do? Do you have a plan? What are you going to do? Who's at home? Who else knows about this? How long have you been thinking about this? And you can invite the person to sort of, because they may or may not have had anyone ask them that clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And that way it's like, oh, yeah, okay, I'm not that far, but I do need to get some help, and at least I'm talking about it now.
Yeah.
To your point, lots of times with men, we don't speak much. And, we learn how to speak in certain, 140 character statements.
Mm-hmm.
And we learn how to text, but we don't learn always, in a sense, to hear the white between the black of the letters.
Yeah, and I would hazard a guess that for pilots, that's probably even worse at speaking about feelings, opening up. Certainly, I mean, in my position, I'm lucky pilots do reach out and they do open up, and I always am thankful and thanks someone, because that's not an easy thing to do, is call someone and open up. It takes a lot of courage. It would certainly take a lot of courage to ask a question to someone you felt was struggling as well. So I want to acknowledge that's not an easy thing to do on the person who's worried about them.
The job itself creates a lot of struggles, in the sense that, the heavy workload, the scheduling, you're not working with the same people every month, your schedule isn't the same, and so just the work itself is very isolating and can create lots of struggles. And, there's not always a lot of other people. Maybe your wingman, your first officer, or your captain, you can ask for help. But you don't want to sort of go, yeah, I didn't do that landing really well. Maybe I should go for training. No, we're not going to say that.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, so there's a lot of performance anxiety that we put on ourselves with our work. And lots of times with our families, we can have our 4-day trip. Sometimes that's a really good break because everything else that's going on at home, we're far from families. They're not nearby. Maybe we can do the FaceTime and everything, but we can't say goodnight to the kids. We can't be there for the graduation. We can't be there for the hockey game where, your son scores the first goal. And so there's a sense that I'm missing out. And so sometimes that family stress can really wear heavy.
Yeah.
And so, and we feel quite lonely. There's nothing like, yes, there's some value at being a slam clicker, but it's pretty lonely.
Yeah, I will say that's as a pilot, you can get to know your first officer, your captain really well, especially if you do 4 or 5 days together. However, you may not see that pilot for years again. The social aspect on stressors on ourselves for loneliness, susceptibility to that is certainly a contributing factor, I think, for everyone.
Correct, and it makes it, and it's particularly accentuated within the pilot or the flight crew basis, because we're not working and because the schedules are not the same, and we don't see somebody that we trained with. We may not see them for another 3 to 4 years, and if they changed up bases or they go to a different piece of equipment, suddenly it's like, oh, I really liked flying with him. Well, that was then and this is now. Maybe you get to see them at sim, but that's it. Yeah. So there's a lot of disconnect from that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I can add is that, lots of times the real issue is, and this is where peers can be really supportive, how many negative life events do you have right now? Back in the 60s, there was this screening tool called the Holmes-Ray Life Inventory. And it's about 53 items that say, have you had a divorce? Have you had a vacation? Have you moved houses? Have you had a parent who's been ill? And by just asking a person how many life events, the Holmes-Ray scale actually, if you scale it, if you get about 150 points, it's like, oh, you're at risk for a physical illness. And so it's really helpful, and that's a way that you can talk about, hey, what's been going on in life lately? Mm-hmm. And yes, you can talk about the vacation, but, a really intense vacation, I mean, for any of us in the aviation business, we know what it's like to go on vacation if we're non-revving. Holy cow, we don't even know whether we'll really get there. And are we going to pivot to Miami or are we going to pivot to Mexico?
Yeah, then these are all inevitable in life.
Correct.
All these things. And so, like you say, you could be dealing with multiples of these at a time on top of the regular work, inherent stressors of us. And you may not see it coming, I guess. It could creep up on someone.
Correct.
And they don't understand why they're feeling this way or
Right.
being there.
And one of the other things is often we take for granted our health. We do everything we can to make sure that we're reporting for health and we're a healthy person, and we keep it together to, show up for our medical and everything. But, do we talk much about our mental health? Not so much. And yet that's where, looking at all the negative life events, looking at what the stressors are, does that mean that we need time off? No. We need a bit of time to be able to talk to someone, to be able to just help normalize it. Because we're really good as pilots being able to say, hey, I know how to do this. There's a checklist. I've been through this before. I don't know this, but I've got a partner next to me. We can figure this out. Pilots are really quite resourceful. The hard part is when it starts to move into an area that we haven't, in a sense, received training. Mm-hmm. And that's where, how do we have these conversations and how do we invite people to just say, hey, I'm having a hard time. It's okay.
Yeah. I wanted to get into a bit of some warning signs, I guess, just generalize, and this certainly isn't expected to make us experts in figuring out if someone is suicidal, but the American Association of Suicidology has an acronym, Is Path Warm? I'll just kind of run through them. We can talk about them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Is ideation, which is suicidal thoughts, and S is the substance abuse. Purposelessness, anxiety, trapped, hopelessness or helplessness, withdrawal, anger, recklessness, and mood changes. I mean, that is a fairly extensive list, and I would hazard a guess that, we do feel these at some point in our lives. Everyone, doesn't mean that we're suicidal necessarily, but.
And it may be helpful just even to talk a little bit about some of those individual ones. There's a sense of, is it threatened suicide? Well, I'll just leave, or I'd be better if I was dead. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, oh, well, let's talk about that. Do you have a plan, or has it been communicated, or is it sort of back channeled, or sort of just silenced? And so even, is there an idea that you're looking to leave or to harm yourself? Substance abuse, absolutely. Excessive use, especially like a one-time event. As I mentioned, when someone is under the influence of alcohol, there's a whole bunch in the brain that starts to get triggered or that doesn't get triggered, and so the judgment is not so clear. And not only is judgment not clear, but the executive functioning of the brain, being able to look at the whole picture and be able to sort of see what the long-term or play the scenario forward.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that can lead to that impulsivity.
Correct. Correct.
In
because
those mental states of, okay.
Yes, because it not only dampens the sort of the executive functioning. What are you doing here? No, don't do that. That's dampened when you're under the influence of alcohol or other drugs.
Okay.
And it can also then increase the pain threshold. It doesn't have as much pain because in some ways you've taken this substance which helps numb some pain. And so therefore you'll just do things that are even more reckless. Okay. So alcohol is a big piece of that and has a significant bearing. No reasons for living, that purposelessness. What's the point? Why bother? I'm just a paycheck. And so that sense of purpose or lack of purpose, or what are the parts of where you would get some meaning in life, and where do we get to talk about that? And so sometimes that's really important. If we're having poor sleep cycle or insomnia or being agitated, being anxious, sleep is a big one. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you do how do you schedule your now that you've got 18 years in, you probably know what flights not to book and to schedule. Oh. No early mornings, no late nights, no more than 3 days. I mean, the whole bidding system becomes a bit of an art, but it's about figuring out what's the best way to keep your sleep system balanced.
Most definitely, and I certainly don't sleep as well as I did when I was younger, and mm-hmm. This job has more late nights and early mornings and red eyes, and certainly ideally if I could work daytime shifts, I'd try to do that until the end of the career, but that's not necessarily the case for us. It's a mixed bag at times, and so you do have to pay attention to those sleep. So where am I going to get it? Because I know I'm going to be doing red eye. How am I going to keep up with that?
And you're right. You're not the same man that you were 10 years ago, where you just pushed on through because you could suck it up with the jet lag. And so, I've worked with folks that say, no, I'd only do West Coast flying, or I only do East Coast, so that way I'm not changing time zones all over the place.
Yeah.
And, for some people doing the overseas flights, it just messes them up too much that, yes, the opportunities are great, but the personal cost may be too much.
Yeah, I find those quite difficult. Some pilots are better than others. Sure. I try to go north-south and stay in my time zone and be in my bed every night. I find that keeps me much more level and whatnot. So
often there's a sense of feeling trapped. Is path warm? The T represents feeling trapped. And there's a sense of, well, there's no options. The checklists are really useful because often out of a checklist will come a certain way of going here, what is the flow chart, what are the options. But we don't always build out the options that are available in our home life. And so lots of times it's about, well, what are the options available? Well, there's none. I've got to be the dad that does all of this. And it's like, well, who else could you have? There's no one. And so we get into sort of this rigid or fixed thinking.
And can that trapped also mean, obviously they don't see a way out, but suicide isn't the problem. It's the other problem that can't be figured out, and they can't do it on their own, And that's what I have been reading about, and that trap feeling, that's where that comes from.
And it does, because we have, in a sense, a little less variability and flexibility in our thinking. We get sort of tied into a really rigid way of looking at it. There's only one flow chart, or there's only one checklist. And it's like, often with these kinds of things, there's a variety of them. Yes, we may rule some of them out, but it's important to have the conversation.
Yeah, it's a little more nuanced than if this, not go there or do that. It's the more holistically.
It's similar to, I would offer that, when we become an early pilot, we do things very strictly by the book. In very many ways, we're like a technician. And then with a number of years of experience, we become more of a craftsman, until all of a sudden we move into almost this sense of being an artist with our flying. Yes, we're following the checklist, but we do it in such a way that there's a real art to it, and we're no longer as trapped by, well, the book says it this way. So,
Doug, we mentioned about how can we ask someone what's the right way to ask, and we say it's a direct question. Now, if someone is to say yes, now we have that burden, that responsibility. That's no small thing to carry, essentially. And where do we go from there? I think is a logical question, and we should discuss. I suspect. I know Canada in the last year has changed their crisis suicide helpline. It's now 988. That aligns with the American helpline as well. They do say if someone is imminently has plans to die, that 911 should be called, and the person ensure that they're not left alone if that's at all possibility.
Correct. And you can ask those kinds of questions to be able to say, hey, who's around? Who else knows the struggle? What's been going on? Who are the resources available? I'm going to hold you. Let's call this number together. Sometimes let's go get you some help, and to be able to continue to offer that support.
Yeah, bring other people in.
Bring
the professionals.
Correct.
Right? Yes. Okay.
Similar to what you do in the cockpit, probably when there's a problem here with the maintenance issue. You call ATC. You call within the WestJet group. You call the ops center, and they were able to pull somebody in from the maintenance. And so there's always somebody who you can call. And so how do you do that same? Like I said, we do this really well in our pilot or professional lives. How do we do this also with the loved ones that we have nearby, in saying, all right, so what are the resources? Are there, is there a weapon in the house? What can we do to help de-escalate the situation? So I want to go back to the other four aspects of the warm. Is path warm? If you notice that somebody suddenly is no longer hanging out with you, if a friend is no longer, you're not calling them or they're not calling you, there's a sense of disconnect. And what we're really paying attention to there is a real change of behavior. If all of a sudden he was involved with playing hockey and no longer is he coming out to the games, it's like, hey, what's going on? What's happening? Mm-hmm. So withdrawal is a big impact when people start to pull back, or in a similar fashion, they let things go. It's like, oh, I don't need this anymore. And you're thinking, what? Why are you giving me this set of tools? And so, watching the sense of, is a person withdrawing from active living or involvement?
Okay.
And so that's a really important part. Rage, anger, it's really common. Sometimes health conditions will trigger this, but that sense of injustice, or things aren't right, or things don't make sense, and when people start to have rage or start seeking revenge, it's like, ooh, careful, because again, there's a question of what's going on with their impulsivity.
I see.
And so that's an important part. Risky acts or unthinking. I don't know what I was thinking, but I decided that it was really slippery. So, sure, let's just give it the gas and go and drive somewhat recklessly. What's that about? Mm-hmm. So, and again, the mood changes. So, that group that provides this, the suicide, that is path warm, it's really helpful.
Yeah.
Because it really says, it goes, what are the factors? What is those short forms to be able to say, hey, what are these factors that I need to be keeping an eye for, whether it be with our kids, with our seniors, because this happens for everyone.
Yeah, that's the American Association of Suicidology. They actually have a podcast, which I listen to quite a few, quite informative, and certainly opens up more conversations about suicide. So one thing I kept coming across is, protective measures they talk about in a group, positive environments, caring communities. Caring communities, that's a maybe a strange word for pilots to say, or hard word for us to say. It's a hard thing to do because of our lack of sort of coming into the office every day together. You don't see that. So do you see, how can we as a pilot group kind of support these sort of protective measures in a caring community?
Well, much of the protective measures, first of all, starts with the person in the mirror. That sense that is like, what am I doing for protective measures? And so, where is my physical fitness? Because that is one of the risk factors. If you're not physically fit or doing some kind of effort to stay in the body, if you're always in your head, you need to get into the body as well. And so that's a really important part. So the physical health, the sense of what am I doing to manage or to cope? Do I have the coping skills to be able to work through these struggles? And if I don't, well, then where can I get some more coping skills? That social support is really important. And it may be that, it's only the guy that, we do some woodworking with, in our garage. That may be the social support. Often we think social support needs to be this, how many likes and how many friends do we have on our Facebook and everything. No, it's actually about sort of the quality of it. And so being able to say, all right, so who do you talk to? Who's the guy that you talk to? It may be another pilot. It may be, your neighbor who has nothing to do with aviation. And so it's about where is the social support and, the people to ask for help, the people of where do I have the friendship, where do I have the connections with people. It may be the fact that I go motorcycling once a month. Whatever it takes. It may be the twice a year hunting trip.
Sure.
But it's about where is the social and how important those are, because they serve as really important protective features. The sense of purpose. What am I doing? Yes, I can earn a good living as a pilot, but wow, that's not what I'm living for. I'm living to, be the parent for my son. And so by being able to sort of say, well, what is my purpose? And if I have questions about that, well, that's where it can be useful to be able to talk to somebody and say what's going on with that. The whole sense of, do I have a sense of self-esteem, and what is my healthy thinking approach? How do I not ruminate? Much of these things are sort of counterintuitive, because you think, well, of course I can do this. Yes. Do I do it in all of my affairs? Do I do it in all areas of my life, or do I do it just really well in my pilot world, but I don't do it so well in my personal world and going to see the doctor or going to see the dental hygienist? How do we expand it so that way there's all of these other protective factors? Yeah. And so even inviting people to say, what's the protective factor that you're using, or how are you protecting? The pilot assistance team is really, really important. But there may be other groups within ALPA who provide that kind of support. What would they be? What are some of the other groups that within ALPA that are really useful?
The pilot assistance team is sort of, we would love for pilots to reach out to us. Maybe we're not always the appropriate team for certain things. Pilot recovery program, which is a substance use disorder group where pilots, they go to that program, and that is fully supported. Actually, the most support they will be in that system. Obviously, that would be if drugs or alcohol, our pilots are dealing with it. So the supportive factors there, certainly, those were the two main groups in the ALPA world, certainly. However, a lot of times some of our reps and pilots, they will talk to pilots who may be struggling, and often they will recommend they come and speak to a pilot assistance team member, which we always appreciate, because there's a lot of connections going on throughout the union and throughout our pilot group, let's say.
I would offer that, I'm aware that ALPA particularly has training around CIRP, and so when there's a critical incident, but we get to know who those critical incident trained peers are, or the people who are on the aeromedical committee. because, again, that's about a health issue or whether it be a physical health or a mental health. It's about another resource to be able to talk to.
Yeah.
And by being able to say, hey, there's a whole bunch of us. And yeah, you could call the PRP. It's like, I'm not here for substance use, but, I got a friend. The people involved in the PRP or the people involved in aeromedical or the CIRP will be very much people who are recognizing that there's a resource available.
Yeah, and
help steer the right way.
These terms we're talking about here too, maybe some pilots aren't necessarily familiar with them. There's a lot of acronyms in aviation, and these are just more to add to the bunch. And so in these series, we actually hope to produce and record some more podcasts, highlighting these CRP, which stands for Critical Response Program, as well as aeromedical, pilot assistance team, and possibly, pilot recovery program. So thanks for bringing that up, Doug. We hope that that people can reach out and know that there's that support for them, pilots.
Because sometimes we're not prepared to talk about the real issue, but we're prepared to talk to someone and see where it will go.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be that I talk to CIRP because I have this major incident or this really traumatic event that I didn't know where it came from, and how do I even work with this, and how do I even get the resources available? Mm-hmm. And so it's not about only finding the right resource. It's not always the right resource. It's finding a resource and getting the process to get there.
Yeah, the one that you're comfortable opening up in.
And maybe someone, or you trust that if I talk to Keith, I know that he'll steer me right way. Or maybe I talk to Scott, and it's like, oh, well, do you know anything about this? And because they've been around a while, or they run in different circles than I do. But it's about sort of reaching out and getting some support.
Doug, for those of us struggling, and I include myself in this conversation, and that these losses of friends and colleagues in the last few months and the last year has been really difficult to move forward and reconcile the tragedy of all of this. Could you, the grief of this is a lot to hold. Could you, speak to that a little bit?
And so grief is that really tricky part. And a lot of times with grief, it's about beginning to actually talk about it, disclose and explore what is it meant inside. And so being able to find whether it be an individual or whether it be a group or whether it be, it can be a variety of different people, whether it's a religious leader that you may be participating in or a sports coach or, another set of moms that are sort of walking through these issues. Being able to talk about it is really important. And because sometimes talking about it doesn't mean that there's a solution. We're not always focusing on the outcome. We're focusing on how did we get there? Similar to, there's a real sense that we need to be able to figure out how do I come to grips with the loss and what did it mean for me? And so, because that's the part that really troubles us and keeps us awake during our respective 3 till 5 or 6 a.m. Framework is. Mm-hmm. Because those are the times when, how come and why and what's that question and what's the response? And being able to explore that is really helpful. And it's not always through an official or formalized therapy group. It can be done with a variety of, you're hanging out with the guys that are making, gardening or, with your spouse. And you're doing the gardening together, or you're going grocery shopping, and it's those times in the car that you talk, or with your kids and how you acknowledge what's happened. And so it's about being able to talk about it. Yes, it's not an easy topic. The idea of losing someone that's been really important, whether it be through suicide or through an expected health loss and passing, none of them are easy. And so it's important to be able to find the way in which you can speak and in a sense, get back on the beam in a good way.
Well, thanks, Doug. I think we've done that today. We explored it to start that conversation. I hope that's been helpful for others. I think it has for me, thinking about this a lot in the last little while. I really want to thank you for being here and providing your thoughts and your expertise and professional ideas in this. And it's been really helpful, I think. So,
well, thanks for having me. It's not an easy topic to talk about. And so, thank you.
Thanks again to the pilots out there and whoever may be listening to this podcast and conversation about suicide and suicide awareness. Please remember, if you're struggling or you know someone that may be struggling with suicide, positive action can rekindle some hope. At WestJet, we have Pilot Assistance Team, where the number is 1-855-957-2843, and you can call that 24 hours a day. And we have members, peers, ready for to listen and speak with you. As well, Suicide Crisis Helpline is, you can call or text the number 988. We just want to remind you that help is here for you. You are not alone. Thank you for listening to this special edition of PIREP, the WestJet Pilot Podcast.